wisdom of the middle way. Nagarjuna's Mulamadhyamakarika. Translation and commentary by J. L. Garfield. Part 2, the text and commentary. Chapter 19, Examination of Time. Another response to the attack on the reality of action and its consequences might to be argue that, nonetheless, the time in which action and its consequences are realized must be real. Nagarjuna in this chapter argues that time cannot be conceived of as an entity existing independently of temporal phenomena, but must itself be regarded as a set of relations among them. His arguments are closely akin to those of Zeno, Sextus, and McTaggart.
1. If the present and the future depend on the past, then the present and the future would have existed in the past. Nagarjuna's method is to divide time into the past, the present, and the future, and then to argue that none of these can be said to inherently exist. In these first two verses, he considers one horn of an implicit dilemma: the present and the future either depend upon the past or they do not. In these two verses he considers the possibility that they do depend upon the past. But if they depend upon it in any sense that could plausibly guarantee their inherent existence, they must somehow emerge from it as a basis. If so, he argues, they must have existed in the past. For if they did not, then we would have the situation where when the time on which they ostensibly depend exists they do not exist, or a situation where at the time they exist that on which they ostensibly depend does not exist. We would then either have the situation in which the ostensibly dependent exists, but in the absence of that on which it depends, or in which the necessary condition exists, but without that of which it is the condition. This raises two difficulties, one general and one specific to the case at hand. First, by the arguments developed concerning the temporal relations between causes and their effects in chapters 1 and 7, we have two incoherent situations from the standpoint of anyone who considers the causal relation or its relata to be inherently existent. There must be a real relation between the cause and the effect in which the effect is contained. Potentially in the cause, and this would unfortunately entail the past existence of the present and the future. But second, there is a little regress to be developed. For if the present and the future depend upon the past, they must succeed or be simultaneous with it. But they must succeed or be simultaneous with it in time. That requires a supertime in which the parts of time are related, and so on, ad infinitum.
2. If the present and the future did not exist there, how could the present and the future be dependent upon it? That is, if we deny that the present and the future existed potentially in the past and were somehow coexistent with it, there is no way to understand the mechanics of the dependency relation. By the time the present comes around, the past isn't around to give rise to it. And when the past was around, the present didn't occur.
3. If they are not dependent upon the past, neither of the two would be established. Therefore neither the present nor the future would exist. If, on the other hand, one argued that the parts of time are independent, there would be no sense in which they would be determinately ordered and in which they would be part of the same time. Time is by definition an ordering of events in which moments stand in determinate relations to one another, in virtue of which the location of any moment depends on the location of all of the others. The present is the present only because it is poised within the past and the future. If it were not, it would not be the present. So either the present is in the past, in which case it is non-existent, or it is independent of the past and the future, in which case it is non-existent.
4. By the same method, the other two divisions past and future, upper, lower, middle, etc., unity, etc., should be understood. That is, we can generalize this argument about the dependency of the future and present, whose narrow purpose is to demonstrate the non-existence of the present, to demonstrate the non-existence of the past and future as inherently existent entities. Moreover, Nagarjuna notes, this argument applies, mutatis mutandis, to spatial relations.
5. A non-static time is not grasped. Nothing one could grasp as stationary time exists. If time is not grasped, how is it known? This is a second destructive dilemma. Time, if it exists as an entity, is either stationary or changing. To say that it is changing is incoherent. We would need to posit a supertime in which that change occurs. But to say that it is static is incoherent as well. That suggests that past, present, and future coexist. So there is no coherent conception of time as an entity.
6. If time depends on an entity. Then without an entity how could time exist? There is no existent entity. So how can time exist? Finally, Nagarjuna argues, we cannot suppose that time exists as one entity dependent on some other as its ground if we want time to exist inherently. This is because, in the previous arguments in the text, we have already argued that none of the entities that exist in time are inherently existent. So none would form a suitable ontological basis for an inherently existent time. But this final verse is double-edged, and its positive reading contains Nagarjuna's positive account of the nature of time. Nagarjuna points out that with no entities to be temporally related, there is no time. That is, the only mode of existence that time has is as a set of relations among empirical phenomena. Apart from those phenomena and those relations, there is no time. But that means that, given the lack of inherent existence of phenomena, there can be no inherent existence of time. Time is thus merely a dependent set of relations, not an entity in its own right, and certainly not the inherently existent vessel of existence it might appear to be.